Hey everybody, Bearded Gaius here. Worked really hard last night and I was able to make some facial hair. Today I'm going to talk to you about sharpening with the Tormek. So during the class we obviously spend a lot of time on working with hand tools, so we show you how to work with chisels and how to sharpen them by hand and so on. But then we also show you some power tool options. So that's what I'm going to do today. If you get into timber framing professionally, you will have many tools to sharpen. The Tormek is a motorized water-cooled grinding system. The sharpening stone turns at about 150 revolutions per minute. It is water-cooled, so there is no dust created. It's a very cool process, so you don't worry about damaging your chisels, slick, plane irons, things like that. It's important to note that what I'm showing you really is just the tip of the iceberg today. There are many other things that you can sharpen on the Tormek, such as drill bits, axes, scissors, shears, all sorts of turning tools, micro turning tools, and so on. But today I'm just going to walk you through the process of sharpening a chisel. So we talk a lot during the class about how important it is to have a sharp chisel to make the cutting process pleasant. So I have a nice sharp chisel here. You can see that it's taking very fine shavings and leaving a nice smooth surface. What I would like to do is dull this chisel and show you how it performs. If you have a weak stomach, you might want to turn away. Whew, that should do. So now that it's dull, you can see that it really just doesn't do anything in the wood. I can't take thin or thick shavings. It's just grabbing and breaking the wood. So let's walk through the process of getting the tool sharp again on the Tormek. The first thing you want to do is get the jig for the Tormek set up so that you are sharpening the correct angle on your chisel, whatever that is. So we like to grind the chisel to a 30-degree angle when we're working with a wood like eastern white pine. So this arm just sets on the Tormek. There's a thumb screw here that allows you to make micro adjustments for lifting and raising the arm. It is the height of the arm above the grinding wheel, and again the amount of projection of the chisel through the honing guide that will set the angle. But this jig will help us do that, and it has two different things that you check. The first is over here the diameter of the wheel, and that is indicated on the front side of the Tormek. This wheel does wear out over time. The diameter gets smaller, and that will affect how far the chisel needs to project through the honing guide to get the correct angle. So this wheel is at approximately 240 millimeters, so I will set this side of the jig to 240 millimeters, all right, and just lock that in right there. The other side is the angle that you would like on your chisel. I already have that set to 30. But I'll just loosen it up so you can see this just pivots back and forth. All right, so this side refers to angular degrees for your chisel. Then you'll take the chisel, slide it through the honing guide, bevel down like this. There are two registration pins on the side that allow you to get the chisel parallel to the wheel. So with the jig set to the wheel diameter and the angle of the chisel that you're trying to capture, you can now put the chisel into the honing guide and actually engage that on the rest. You want to make sure that both of these thumb screws are tightened down uniformly so that this clamping bar is touching all the way across on the chisel. And then you just pivot that to the wheel and you set the jig on the chisel so that the flat part here is sitting on the back side of the chisel and this circular part rests on the wheel. And you adjust by just raising or lowering this guide arm until the flat part of the jig is parallel to the back side of the chisel. You want even contact all the way across. So in this case, I've got a gap on the front. I need to lower the arm till I've got good contact all the way across. You want to make sure that the chisel is touching the stone while you're making this adjustment. It won't help you if it's floating in the air. All right, just making sure that the guide bar is in fact seated all the way down. I've got good contact on the chisel between the jig and the chisel and the stone. I can now go ahead and lock that guide bar into place, and I've basically just made this setup so that we'll grind a 30-degree angle. The stone is of course circular, so it is going to create a concave shape on the chisel. This guide does take into account that fact, so it's the very front edge that will actually be 30 degrees. We're not measuring 30 degrees from the front edge to the back edge. So in other words, we are taking into account the fact that this chisel will be hollow ground. We'll still end up with a 30-degree angle. At this point, you're ready to turn on the Tormek. This trough here is just holding water, so as the wheel is spinning, it's picking up water, keeps everything wet. It floats off the steel from the chisel and the abraded stone from the wheel. There is a magnet inside this trough, so the steel that's getting chafed off just goes right to that magnet and doesn't recirculate on the wheel. I always like to check just to make sure I'm somewhat close. Okay. And I can see that I'm hitting back here on the heel of the chisel. So now it's just a matter of continuing to grind until the whole surface of the chisel is hitting the stone. So you notice that I'm moving the chisel back and forth. That does two things. One is that it wears out the stone uniformly, but it also makes the grinding process go a little bit faster because not only is the stone grinding this way into the chisel, but it's also grinding side to side on the chisel. I find that using the Tormek usually cuts my sharpening time at least in half compared to the hand tool method that we showed you earlier. So people often ask how much pressure I'm applying. That's a difficult question for me to answer in pounds, but I would say that I'm pushing down with around 3 to 4 pounds of force. And again, I'm making sure that most of my pressure is right up here on the front so that I'm not deflecting this guide bar. Now that I've sharpened for a little bit, I like to pull the chisel off and take a careful look. It's very easy to see the difference between the stropped edge that was on here and the ground edge that I'm now creating. So it's quite obvious. We have these very deep score marks that go all the way across the chisel, but are just missing over here. You can see this triangular shaped area. So probably the last time I sharpened this, I was not quite square in the guide. And much like we did in the hand sharpening process, periodically I'll just run my finger across the back of the chisel and I'll be able to feel the burr. When I can feel that burr all the way across, that's a good indication that I'm done. I'll give it a visual check one more time and then we'll move on to the stropping process. Just a tiny little bit left. Okay, now I can see that I have nice uniform score marks from front to back all the way across the chisel. I can feel a nice burr all the way across. So we're basically done with the grinding and honing process. That's what's nice about the Tormek, is that it combines those two phases of sharpening into one. When you buy the Tormek, it does come with what is called a grading stone, and it is a combination stone, coarse on one side, fine on the other. It actually allows you to impregnate the stone with either coarser particles or finer particles, depending on what you're trying to do. So if you have catastrophic damage to your chisel because you've dropped it or ground it against a piece of steel, you might want to charge the stone with some of that coarser grit, and that will make the sharpening process faster. If you have a very hard tool like a Japanese chisel or slick that you're sharpening Toward the end of the grinding process, you might want to charge it with the finer side of that grading stone, and that will help decrease the score marks, and that will basically just make the stropping process go a little more quickly. This is a relatively milder steel, so I don't bother doing that here. I'll just move on to stropping. One last thing that I would point out is that the sides of the stone have been ground very flat, so you can actually address the backside of your chisel or slick or plane iron on the side of the stone simply by putting it like this and then engaging the side of the stone. I'm not going to bother doing that because the backside of the chisel is very nicely stropped from the last sharpening, so I don't need to flatten it at this point. All right, I'm going to turn the Tormek off and spin it around, because when you're stropping, you only want to strop with the wheel turning away from you. This is basically just a piece of leather that's been glued to the wheel. If I tried stropping into the tool, I would just peel that leather right off. When it comes to the stone, you can sharpen in either direction. You can sharpen into the stone or away from the stone. I was sharpening into, meaning the stone was turning into the chisel. I do that because it's faster. It's a slightly more aggressive way to sharpen. If you're working with very fine tools, gouges, things like that, you might consider sharpening away from the stone because it will take steel off a little bit more slowly, and those delicate tools, you really don't want to take off a lot of steel. All right, so the process here is the same, but since I'm stropping on a soft leather wheel, I don't bother using the jig. I'll just use my eye to get the leather strop in contact with the chisel. And it's best to look from the side. If you have a little flashlight, you can shine it in there and see if you've got good contact all the way across. This looks decent. All right, so again, I'll lock the guide bar into place. And Tormek has this proprietary paste that you can charge this stropping wheel with. It behaves a little bit like the aluminum oxide powder that we showed you in the hand sharpening demonstration. This is in a paste though, so it just clings to that spinning wheel. All right, so I've been stropping for about 20 seconds, 15 seconds. I can hear a very audible difference between when I started and now. In the beginning, it's sort of a coarse, abrasive sound. The stropping wheel has already polished up that steel, so it's a smooth surface riding against a relatively smooth surface. So very quickly, I am getting to my sharp edge. Just going to continue stropping. And as I go, it gets a little quieter and a little quieter as the steel gets polished. Again, I'm just moving the chisel back and forth like I did with the wheel, the grinding wheel. This time I'm mostly doing it because the strop wheel is not wide enough to hit the whole chisel, so you have to move it back and forth. But again, the advantage is more contact between the leather and the chisel. At this point, I like to pull the chisel off and move it around a little bit in the light, and you can very quickly see exactly where the strop wheel is hitting the chisel. So on the back side, the heel, which is the edge that I care a little bit less about, is beautifully polished. So I'm hitting the heel a little bit too much. All of the score marks left by the wheel are basically gone. So I'm going to loosen up the guide bar, and I'm going to push it back a little bit so that the strop will tend to hit the toe of the chisel a little bit more, or the cutting edge of the chisel. And periodically I'm just taking the excess strop abrasive from the side of the chisel and putting it back into the wheel. I'm going to bring this back a little bit more, still not quite hitting the toe of the chisel. All right, at this point I've got a nice polish front to back. Most of the grinder marks are gone. I can still see a few in the middle of the chisel, which should not really affect the performance. I'm not going to bother stropping beyond the point where I can see that the toe is nicely polished. Just going to wipe off some of that excess strop abrasive. And the last thing I'll do is just a very, very brief stropping on the back side of the chisel. I don't want to do too much there because it will eventually roll the back side of the chisel like this. So when I go to pair with the chisel, if it's rounded up like that, it's difficult to get the chisel to engage into the wood. But I do want to make sure I've removed the burr and just give that back edge a very quick polish. All right, let's see how we did. Looks good. We're back to a nice smooth surface and the wood is shaving nicely. So that's the sharpening process with the Tormek. Thanks for watching. If you're ever in Woolwich, stop in. We can give you a live demonstration.
Hey there, thank you for watching. Here at Shelter Institute in Woolwich, Maine, we teach a wide variety of house building and timber framing and carving classes. We'd love to see you here, but if you can't make it to Maine to take one of our classes, our online class is available at shelterinstitute.com.